Now, a lot of times with my 8th grade students, I will get a one-word answer, and it drives me bananas. So a way of probing is if a student gives me a one-word answer, I simply respond with one-word answer, and they know, oh, I need to expand a little bit on what I had just said. I'm John Van Dusen, longtime teacher, coach, and Army officer. Welcome to your classroom coffee break. So asking the right types of questions in a middle school or elementary, high school classroom can really enhance student engagement and understanding. So I'm going to give you a breakdown of 10 different types of questions that you can incorporate into your lessons. And then I'm also going to share a blog post back from December 2022 where I talk with my students about different types of questions that I ask them and how they responded. So the first type is factual questions, and these questions have one right answer. An example would be, who was the third president of the United States? Who wrote the Declaration of Independence? You ask these questions in order to get recall and ensure students are understanding the factual information that you're putting out. Second type of question is conceptual questions. And the purpose of conceptual questions is to encourage understanding of broader ideas or topics. So an example of this would be, why do we have checks and balances in our government? It's actually going to force the students to understand the three branches of government and then conceptualize why we have those three branches and how they integrate and work together. Another example would be, what does the freedom of speech mean in practice? Or how does geography influence the economy of a region? Those questions are going to go beyond the basic facts and force the students to take the facts that they know and actually put them into practice. So the third type of question you can ask is going to be an analytical question. And the purpose is to develop critical thinking by examining relationships or causes. So an example of this might be, why do you think the Constitution was written the way that it was? Or how did the French and Indian War contribute to the American Revolution? So these types of questions are going to take a student's brain into knowing the facts, knowing the concepts, and then analyzing why things are the way they are. Another example of a question might be, what would have happened if the South had won the Civil War? Again, it's going to take that student who knows some facts, knows the concepts, and now they're going to analyze what they know and put it into practice. Fourth type of question that you can ask is an application question. And application questions are going to encourage students to apply knowledge to new scenarios. And I really like these types of questions because it really gets a student thinking. So an example would be, if you were living during the Revolutionary War, which side would you support and why? Another type of application question could be, how could you use the Bill of Rights to solve a current issue? Or what lessons from history can we apply to today's society? And that question right there is something I try to incorporate almost every day in my teaching. It's very difficult for adults and students to understand what life was like in the late 1700s throughout the 1800s because we're so far removed from that. TV wasn't a thing. There was no radio, no DVDs, no podcasts. Basically, the only way people could communicate was via letter or the spoken word. And even though most people have one of these in their pockets right now, it's mostly used to do things other than talk, which again was the primary form of communication during the period of history I teach. So I'm always trying to say, what can we learn from what we just talked about, or how can we apply it to today's society? And there's still a ton of applications, specifically in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Just look at the freedom of speech. It seems like every day there's something in the news talking about the freedom of speech. Does it apply to podcasts? Does it apply to YouTube? Does it only apply to written word? And getting students to take those facts that they know, the concepts, analyze it, and then apply it is a really great way to get their brains moving. So the fifth type of question you can ask is an opinion-based question. And I talk about this later in the blog post because middle schoolers are opinionated. But this is to encourage personal reflection and to justify reasoning. So an example of this might be, do you think the Electoral College is still relevant today? Why or why not? Now, that's a great question that we were able to talk about over the past few months because of the presidential election. And it's interesting to watch students have an opinion, then do some research, and then question their own beliefs or question their own opinion, and sometimes even change it. So I love opinion questions. Another example might be, which historical figure do you admire the most and why? In my classroom, we just had a compare and contrast lesson with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Politically, they could not be further apart. And it was a lot of fun to watch my students research both of those characters and then see who they aligned with the most and then explain their why. It was a great project that not only got them to understand the facts required by the state standards, but also to reflect on their own beliefs. The sixth type of question you can ask is hypothetical. And the purpose of a hypothetical question is to stimulate imagination and creative thinking. This is a little bit different than an opinion because this is something that could not happen. An example of this might be, what if the Constitution had never been written? Or how might history be changed if we had lost the Revolutionary War? And these types of questions are great, again, because there's no wrong answer, which I'm going to talk about in the blog post, but it gets students thinking. They know some facts, they know the concepts, they may have analyzed it, and now they're asked to put it into practice with something that could never possibly happen. And sometimes you get some wild ideas, especially out of middle school boys. But sometimes it's a great way to get their brain expanded so that you can put more information in it. Seventh type of question we're going to talk about in this episode is the probing question. And the purpose of a probing question is to deepen understanding and expand on responses. So this is usually going to come out of an already answered question, maybe an opinion or a hypothetical, and you're simply going to ask for more. You're going to probe deeper and see if you can get more out of your students. For instance, can you explain that? Can you explain why you think what you do? Or another example would be, what evidence supports your argument? Or why do you think this event was so significant? Now, a lot of times with my 8th grade students, I will get a one-word answer, and it drives me bananas. So a way of probing is, if a student gives me a one-word answer, I simply respond with one-word answer, and they know, oh, I need to expand a little bit on what I had just said. So the 8th type of question you can ask are comparative questions. These questions are designed to highlight similarities and differences between ideas and events. Probing questions are a great way to get past the facts, past the conceptual, past the analytical, and get students to really think about the topic of discussion. So the 8th type of question you can ask are comparative questions. And these questions are designed to highlight similarities and differences between ideas and events. I just mentioned that we did a project on Jefferson versus Hamilton, compare and contrast. Another example would be, how is the American Revolution similar to other revolutions in history? In my classroom, we talked about the French Revolution and how most Americans were very excited about the French Revolution until they started lopping people's heads off. And then most Americans said, you know what, you went a little too far. And we're coming up on learning about Monroe Doctrine, where most of Central and South America rebelled and gained their independence, similar to our revolution, but a little bit different. So those comparative questions are a great way to see the similarities and differences between two events or two people or groups of people. The 9th type of question you can ask in your classroom is a clarifying question. And this is similar to a probing, but the purpose is to ensure understanding of material or a student response. So an example might be, what do you mean by that? Or can you give an example? One of my favorite clarifying questions is that one right there. Can you give me an example? Because you're going to get a snapshot of what that student is thinking inside their brain, and you'll be able to tell if they're on the right track or if they're confusing two concepts, if they're analyzing something differently. And it's a quick formative assessment to see if your lesson is going the way you want it to. And the 10th type of question you can ask in your classroom is a reflection question. And the purpose of a reflection is to promote self-assessment and metacognition, which basically means you want the students to think about their own thinking. So an example of this might be, what part of today's lesson was most interesting to you? Or which part of today's lesson do you still wonder about? You'll see a lot of these types of questions on maybe an exit ticket or some time of formative assessment, sometimes on a summative assessment. And another way I've heard of this being done was at the bottom of a quiz, the question was asked, tell me some other things you know about this topic that I didn't ask you about. Again, those reflection questions are getting the student to think about their own thinking. So we're going to transition a little bit to a blog post I wrote back in December 2022, talking about 3 types of questions, and you can link them to the 10 types of questions that we just went over. And if you'd like to read this blog post, I will link it down in the show notes. It's called When I Ask, What Do You Think? Picture this, my 8th grade classroom, full of young teenagers, full of awkward hormones, full of wonder, but they also want to look cool. and they're terrified of being embarrassed in front of their classmates. The topic is irrelevant. Here's the question. What do you think? Silence. Interesting. I talk with my students about 3 types of questions. Informational. These questions have exactly one right answer. So in the previous, as we're going through this would be the factual types questions. For example, if the question was, who was the 3rd president of the United States? There is exactly one answer. And if you know it, you know it. And if you don't, you don't. A lot of math problems are informational. There's exactly one right answer, and you can either be right or you're wrong. There is no in between. Second type, opinion. These questions have multiple right answers. The catch is there needs to be some evidence backing your opinion. Opinions vary, and this can lead to some great discussion as long as there's some guardrails in place to prevent arguments from getting out of hand. An example would be, what type of speech should be abridged and is not protected by the First Amendment? As long as you bring some evidence backing your opinion, you're right. These are some of my favorite types of questions to ask. It forces students to establish an opinion based on facts instead of their feelings. This will be great practice for them as they transition into adulthood. The third type of question I ask is, what do you think? A little bit different than an opinion question, and I try very hard to express to my students that when I ask, what do you think? You can't be wrong. Most of the time, these are hypothetical and go so far beyond logic that it would be impossible to have an analytical answer. Something like, if you were to take a trip to Mars, what would you want to do first? Now that I think about it, actually, that question isn't so hypothetical, thanks to SpaceX. Just as a side note, I do have my NASA Artemis mug. If you know, you know. And if you saw Elon Musk on Joe Rogan, he was wearing a shirt that said Occupy Mars. Kind of interesting. It's only been 2 years since I wrote this. It's interesting to see these types of questions play out in my classroom. When I ask an informational question, hands shoot up from students who are sure of their answer. No one else moves, fearful of giving the wrong answer. That's understandable. Giving the wrong answer would mean embarrassment. When I ask an opinion question, I have a lot of hands go up. Amazingly enough, middle schoolers are full of opinions. I'll give you a moment to collect yourself from the shock of that last statement. The best part of opinion questions is students can be right as long as they justify their answer. Sometimes these justifications are pretty sketchy, but at least they're putting some thought into them. These questions generate the most discussion and are most likely the most fun. These questions are great practice for students to explore their beliefs, their thoughts, and motivations. When done correctly, it can open them up to differing opinions and facts they may have missed due to personal bias. And again, one of my favorite projects is the one we do with Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, because they are so different politically, yet they still get along and work together in George Washington's cabinet. Thomas Jefferson being a Democratic Republican, Hamilton being a Federalist, and students go through and see who they relate to the most and why. And even though it was 250 years ago, students are able to bring those experiences into the future and apply them today. It's really cool. All right, back to the blog post. When I ask, what do you think? You can't be wrong. The problem is that it takes a great amount of thinking. When I ask these questions, I'm usually looking out over a vast landscape of confused faces. Sometimes we'll get good discussion, but for whatever reasons, it's difficult for students to engage in these types of questions. But why? They can't be wrong, but they also can't be certain that they're right either. And if they are not right, they must be wrong. And that's embarrassing. Maybe it's because some students believe that they have to be right. There's no option to fail at anything, ever. I wrote a blog post about this when I was a STEM teacher talking about failure, and I'll post that down in the show notes as well. I have students all the time who miss one question on a quiz or worksheet and are at my desk asking for extra credit. Maybe it has something to do with our either-or society. You're either 110% for something or you're 110% against it. There's very little room for anything in the middle. Stating your opinion on a topic can place you into an ideological box that's almost impossible to get out of. That's not good for free thinking or the expression of thoughts. I'm going to keep asking these questions, and I'm going to continue to remind my students that they can't be wrong. Maybe I can help them expand their brains into being able to think a little better, and that's what I think about that. So if you got some value out of this episode, I ask that you like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time for your classroom coffee break.